Yeah, no, that's a great question. And a lot of this is, trying to make connections, and they're not always necessarily causal connections because I think we have to be very clear that there's a lot that's happening, especially, with food prices. There's so many variables at play that it's almost impossible to say, the price of beef went up because of the drought only, right, that we saw back in 2022, or because of increased consumer demand, or the price of tomatoes is up because of fuel prices, just because there's so many confounders. So that's part of the story, is just trying to explain the complexity, but it has to land with the audience. And so, in terms of how I approach this, I try to just come up with one main takeaway. And sometimes it's that complexity that, okay, the story here is that it's not just one thing that's driving food prices, but really this convergence of factors. And I really try to prioritize what I like to think of as the first order effects, especially the first order effects that are very current and timely, that we are starting to see show up in the data. So, for example, what's happening with oil prices, because of the conflict in the Middle East, is very relevant at the moment. And so the audience can really connect with that. And it's a very complex situation. So we have the price of oil that impacts the price of diesel and other refined products, but it also impacts the price of natural gas and fertilizer. And so, what I try to do is really focus on those first order effects, and in some cases, even second order effects if they're critical to the story. So when it comes to food prices, the main pathway from the conflict to higher grocery prices is the price of diesel, because food moves on diesel. But fertilizer is also important. Although the impact of high fertilizer prices is not something that we're going to see really drive grocery prices for more months, or even well into next year, I think it's important to bring it up because it is another important pathway. It may not be very immediate, but it's something that producers are feeling, and it's certainly part of the cost pressures that are impacting the agri-food system. But again, just really try to focus on those first order effects. Try to avoid using a lot of jargon. Try to make the information accessible and connected to individuals. And this is where, certain products can really bring some of these events to life. Like, what's happening with tomatoes. It's sort of that perfect case study of all of these factors coming together. If we talk about the impacts of climate change, and what we're seeing with more intense droughts or floods, sort of extreme weather events, products like beef or coffee are sort of a good case study. But it's important to sort of frame the conversation around the complexity and how much uncertainty there is. And that's, I think, another sort of key aspect of the way that I communicate. When we look at what's happened in the past, we have a lot of good information, and we can be a little bit more accurate in how we share those numbers. But going forward, where we're in the middle of a shock, or an event that's driving prices, it's important to convey that uncertainty, because that is part of what's currently happening. It gives you credibility, and it's the reality of the situation, right? Things can go different directions. And I think it's sort of important to point that out to the audience.